People who speak more than one language have multiple personalities, or at least they experience the world and interact with the world differently in each of the languages that they speak. And I think this is really interesting because it highlights a few key things for me. And the first one is just that language is a big part of the culture that you're in. And the culture that you're in is constantly influencing your experience of life, whether you're aware of that or not. And so certain ideas will come to your mind because they're available in your language and in your culture, for example. But if you are part of another culture or speaking another language, those same ideas might not even exist, or they might be different in some way. And so I think that language is a really interesting part of culture, and culture in general is really interesting because it's very difficult to define what culture is, but language is definitely a big part of what culture is. And so there's all kinds of things that influence our language. Like, for example, I know that there's some languages that have a ton of different words for like snow and ice and stuff like that. Whereas English has a lot less words for that because we don't necessarily need that many distinctions for snow and ice. But if your experience of the world is based on dealing with snow and ice on a regular basis, you might need more words and ideas and concepts related to that. And so I think that when you speak more than one language, when you're speaking one of those languages, you have a certain set of ideas and concepts and background and history and people's experiences that are part of that. And that influences the way that you act and the way that you interact with people and the way that you experience your environment and think about things. And then when you're speaking the other language, then you have a whole set of other factors that are influencing you and what you're thinking about and how you're approaching a situation. And so, of course, it makes sense that people who are fluent in more than one language have multiple personalities or act a little bit differently, think a little bit differently while they're speaking that other language. And so as we kind of know, speaking another language kind of opens up your mind to different ideas and different ways of thinking, and that's very healthy. But for an individual language speaker, if they're speaking one language, they might be acting a certain way in a specific situation. And if they're speaking the other language or the other, maybe they speak 10 languages, and one of the other languages they speak, they might be acting differently in that same situation just because they're speaking that different language. And I think that's really interesting. And that brings me to the second thing that I think is interesting about this idea, and that is the concept of the idiolect. And so a dialect is a way of speaking that a group of people shares, and an idiolect or idiolect is the way that an individual speaks a specific language. So it's already true that the way that I speak and listen to and communicate in English is different than the way you do it. You have a different style. That's called your idiolect. And I have one too, and so do you. And apparently, as an individual, if I speak Spanish, which I'm not fluent in, but I speak, or I speak Thai, which I'm not fluent in, but I speak quite a bit, I will have a different idiolect also in each of those languages. And that's kind of what this is saying. Like, your idiolect is part of your personality or the way that you think and act and interact with the world. And so this really highlights the idea of people having unique idiolects because each individual also experiences every language a little bit differently based on their unique circumstances. So they have the external factors of the culture and the history and all of that behind the language that they're speaking. And then they have their internal unique experience of life as well, and that forms the way that they communicate and interact with the world and think about it and everything that they're doing in life. And so I think language is really interesting, and those 2 points are really highlighted by this topic of people who are multilingual having multiple personalities or interacting, performing their life differently in different situations based on the language that they're speaking right now. And then the third thing that this idea brings up is the difficulty with translating things from one language to another. There's no such thing as specifically translating every single word and phrase from English to Spanish or Armenian to English or Thai to Russian. It doesn't happen that way, and it can't, because all of those languages, again, are attached to the culture that they're in and the history behind it and the concepts and the way people think about things and all these big ideas that are influenced by culture and idiolects as well. And so it's impossible to have a direct one-to-one translation between languages for everything. Sometimes you can do it, but not all the time. And I think that makes translation very difficult. You can't just like learn Spanish from a book and be a great translator from English to Spanish. You have to be part of that Spanish speaking culture of wherever you're trying to communicate to translate it properly. And it's even different in different regions of the world, right? So if you're translating something, a long work, let's say, or some kind of movie or something from English to Spanish, and you're going to show that movie in Spain, or you're going to show it in Guatemala or Cuba or Mexico, you might translate some of that a little bit differently based on the culture of where it's going to translate to. And so I think it's very difficult to translate because you're not just translating words or phrases or concepts, you're translating cultures as well. And so when you're speaking a language, you're part of that. And so, of course, if you're speaking a different language, your personality might come off slightly differently. I remember when I was living in Thailand, I speak quite a bit of Thai, but I'm not fluent. And of course, I don't speak quite like a native speaker. And a lot of times I wished that I could be more of myself in Thai because they're not really getting the version of me that I can perform in English when I'm speaking Thai. It's a muted version of that, and it's not as good, in my opinion. And so there were a lot of times where I was a little frustrated by that I couldn't be myself as much as I wanted to and in Thai. And one of the things that really helped me learn Thai better, by the way, and also might help you learn languages better, is to try to be yourself as much as you can in that language. So I wanted to know the things that I was mostly going to have to deal with, how to say those things, and how to say it in a way that conveys my personality a little bit. So when I was learning Thai, I tried to do it that way as much as I could. However, it's still not completely possible to be your exact same English-speaking self while you're speaking Thai. You can get close, but I don't think it's possible to be that 100%, and it's not possible in any other language, as this article from the New Republic also shows. So I just want to read a little bit from this article, and then we will move on with this topic. So it says, multilinguals have multiple personalities. In an essay published on Monday, New Republic senior editor Noam Schreiber, who grew up speaking both Hebrew and English, explains why he stopped speaking only Hebrew to his 3-year-old daughter. My Hebrew self turns out to be much colder, more earnest, and, let's face it, less articulate, he writes. In English, my natural sensibility is patient and understated. My style in Hebrew was hectoring and prosecutorial. I understand the feeling. My not-so-fluent French self is most comfortable talking about classroom supplies. Yeah, that's what you learn a lot in language classes. It's surprising, though, that people who are actually fluent in 2 languages also feel their personality shifting as they switch between languages. Yet researchers have confirmed this. Between 2001 and 2003, linguists Jean-Marc Dewaile and Anita Pavlenko asked over 1,000 bilinguals whether they feel like a different person when they speak different languages, and nearly 2/3 said they did. And again, like my experience shows, you can kind of be yourself in another language, but I'm not sure if it's possible to replicate it completely. And so how does that play out in day-to-day speech? Well, in 1964, Susan Everett, a sociolinguist at the University of California, Berkeley, set out to explore the differences in how bilinguals represent the same stories in different languages. So she recruited 64 French adults who lived in the United States and were fluent in both French and English. On average, they'd spent 12 years living in the US, and 40 were married to an American. On 2 separate occasions, 6 weeks apart, Irvin gave them the thematic apperception test. She showed her subjects a series of illustrations and asked them to make up a 3-minute story to accompany each scene. In one session, the volunteer and experimenter spoke only French, while in the other session, they only spoke English. Irvin then analyzed the stories, looking at the different themes incorporated into the narratives. When she compared the 2 sets of stories, she identified some significant topical differences. The English stories more often featured female achievement, physical aggression, verbal aggression toward parents, and attempts to escape blame, while the French stories were more likely to include domination by elders, guilt, and verbal aggression towards peers. And then further research by the same researcher took a look at Japanese women living in the San Francisco area. And she basically had a bilingual interviewer give women various verbal tasks in both Japanese and English and found, as she expected, important differences. For instance, when the women were asked to complete a sentence, their answers differed depending on the language in which the questions were asked. So all of this is very interesting, and basically it just shows how important the language that we speak is to our perceptions of things that are happening, to our experience of life, how we act, how we communicate, how we interact with others, because those languages contain a lot of assumptions made by our culture that are difficult, if not impossible, to escape while you're in that frame of that language. And so that frame puts you in a box, and it might be a very big box with a lot of opportunities to play around with it, but you're still in a box whether you're aware of it or not. And that box is both enabling and constraining, which is something we talk about a lot in kind of cultural research. And so a culture allows you to communicate efficiently with other people, but it also constrains you in what you can do, what you can think about, the way you can think about things, the way you can interact with other people. They're not necessarily going to understand you if you're trying to describe a concept that doesn't really exist in English, but maybe it does in Japanese. And if you both speak Japanese, then you can understand each other. And so obviously language is a big part of culture, and it's both enabling and constraining, just like the broader culture in general. And I think this kind of thing is really interesting because things can get lost in translation, even if it's a good translator, because it doesn't take into account the culture and concepts behind that language. And that's very, very difficult. And so one of the problems that I'm not sure these translating apps are going to be able to solve on our phones, even if we can say something into the phone and then it translates it accurately into Japanese or Spanish or some other language, for example, I think that's fantastic. However, in order to get that really right, we're going to have to figure out how to translate that into that other culture as well to be more accurate. And so let's see if our technology wizards can figure that out. And if they do, the world is going to be a much cooler place to live. And I would love to talk to people from every corner of the earth in a more accurate way where we both really understand each other at a deeper level. And we can kind of get the concepts of that other culture at a deeper level. And once we get to that point, I think some really cool things are going to happen. And with that, if you liked this video, I post a new one every single Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, so you can have a little piece of intellectual dark chocolate with your morning coffee or explore an interesting topic while you're getting ready for work or school. So I hope to see you in the next video. Either way, I'm Jim Wolf, and I'll talk to you later, probably in English, and if we speak a different language, who knows what would come out of that.